When Colonel Sarah Chen walked into the Pentagon's most exclusive briefing room and calmly told the Joint Chief she was refusing the Medal of Honor, the silence was so complete you could hear the air conditioning hum. What she said next would change military protocol forever and force America's highest-ranking generals to confront a truth they'd spent decades avoiding. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning Sarah arrived at the Strategic Operations Command Center, she could feel the weight of every stair in the corridor. Her combat boots echoed against polished marble floors as she navigated hallways lined with portraits of military legends, all men, all white, all representing a tradition she was about to challenge simply by existing in their space. The assignment letter in her briefcase felt heavier than the 40-pound pack she'd carried through the mountains of Afghanistan, because this particular battlefield would test skills she'd never needed in combat zones. Strategic Operations Command represented the pinnacle of military planning, where the Pentagon's most critical decisions were made by officers who'd risen through decades of careful political maneuvering and battlefield excellence. It was an environment where a single recommendation could shift global military policy, where careers were made or destroyed in classified meetings, and where the wrong word to the wrong person could end a lifetime of service. Sarah had earned her place here through a combination of tactical brilliance, advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies, and a combat record that included 3 tours in Afghanistan where she'd successfully planned and executed operations that saved hundreds of American lives. But as she approached Conference Room Alpha 7, where she'd spend the next 6 months working on classified strategic initiatives, Sarah understood that her qualifications were about to be tested in ways that had nothing to do with her actual abilities. The conversation she'd overheard yesterday at the officers' club still rang in her ears. Chun certainly qualified on paper, but strategic planning requires a certain kind of ... instinct. Not sure if someone who got their promotion through diversity initiatives has what it takes when lives are really on the line. The comment had come from General Robert Morrison, a man whose own promotion to Strategic Command had coincided remarkably well with his father-in-law's position on the Senate Armed Services Committee. But Morrison commanded respect in these halls, had the ear of senior leadership, and possessed the kind of old-school military presence that made younger officers instinctively straighten their spines when he entered a room. His opinion carried weight, and his skepticism about Sarah's appointment was already filtering through the informal networks that really controlled information flow in the Pentagon. Sarah's first glimpse into Conference Room Alpha 7 revealed exactly what she'd expected. 12 senior officers gathered around a mahogany table that had probably witnessed decisions affecting millions of lives. All of them men, most of them white, several of them old enough to have served when women weren't allowed in combat roles. They looked up as she entered, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. She recognized most of them from their photographs in military publications, colonels and brigadier generals who'd built reputations on successful operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and various classified missions that would never appear in official histories. General Morrison sat at the head of the table, his uniform decorated with ribbons representing campaigns spanning 3 decades. His silver hair was cut with military precision. His posture suggested a man accustomed to command, and his pale blue eyes held the calculating look of someone evaluating potential threats. "Colonel Chun," he said, rising with the kind of formal courtesy that somehow managed to feel dismissive. "Welcome to Strategic Operations. I trust you're prepared for the level of responsibility we handle here." The words carried subtle implications that every person in the room understood. This wasn't just a welcome. It was a test of whether she would recognize her place in the established hierarchy. Sarah responded with equal formality, her voice steady and professional. "Thank you, General Morrison. I look forward to contributing to the mission." The response was safe, appropriate, and completely failed to acknowledge the underlying challenge in his tone. Around the table, officers exchanged glances that suggested they were already forming opinions about her ability to navigate the complex social dynamics that governed decision-making in this environment. Colonel James Burke, Morrison's second-in-command, and a man whose reputation for tactical excellence was matched only by his legendary inability to work with anyone who challenged his methods, gestured toward an empty chair positioned strategically at the far end of the table. "Chun, you'll be handling coordination responsibilities initially. We need someone to manage information flow between departments, ensure all relevant parties receive appropriate briefings, that sort of thing." The assignment was clearly administrative rather than strategic, designed to keep her busy with important-sounding tasks that would have minimal impact on actual decision-making. Sarah understood the dynamics immediately. In any high-level military environment, initial assignments served as both testing grounds and subtle indicators of where new personnel stood in the informal hierarchy. Being assigned to coordination meant she was being evaluated, managed, and kept at arm's length from the real work of strategic planning. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver: give the new person responsibilities that sounded significant, but ensured they couldn't immediately influence critical decisions. "Understood, Colonel Burke," she replied, taking her assigned seat and noting how the physical positioning reinforced her status as an outsider, being gradually integrated into an established system. The other officers resumed their previous conversation about resource allocation for an upcoming joint training exercise, but Sarah noticed how the discussion seemed to flow around her rather than including her. Despite her extensive experience with exactly the kind of logistical challenges they were discussing, Major Linda Rodriguez, the only other woman in the room and someone whose career in military intelligence had earned her grudging respect from her male colleagues, offered Sarah a brief nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much. Rodriguez had her own position to protect and couldn't afford to be seen as forming alliances based on gender rather than professional competence. But it was something. A small gesture that suggested not everyone in the room had already decided she didn't belong. The morning briefing covered ongoing operations in 3 different theaters, resource allocation decisions that would affect thousands of service members, and strategic assessments that required balancing military effectiveness with political considerations. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes not just on the operational details, but on the decision-making processes, the informal alliances between different officers, and the subtle ways that information was shared or withheld based on personal relationships rather than official channels. What struck her most was how often the discussion touched on issues where her combat experience and strategic training were directly relevant, yet no one asked for her input. When Colonel Burke mentioned concerns about supply line vulnerabilities in mountainous terrain, Sarah remained silent despite having personally managed similar challenges during her deployments. When General Morrison discussed the psychological factors affecting troop morale in extended operations, she didn't mention her master's thesis on that exact topic or her first-hand experience implementing morale improvement strategies that had measurably reduced casualties in her unit. The message was clear. Her role was to observe, learn, and gradually earn the right to contribute to discussions that shaped military policy. It was a familiar pattern she'd encountered throughout her career, but never in an environment where the stakes were quite this high or where the resistance felt quite this systematic. These weren't just individual prejudices. They represented institutional assumptions about who belonged in strategic leadership roles and who needed to prove themselves worthy of inclusion. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out, Sarah remained seated, reviewing her notes and processing the complex social dynamics she'd just witnessed. General Morrison approached her table, his expression suggesting paternal concern mixed with professional skepticism. "Colonel Chun, I want to make sure you understand the nature of the work we do here. Strategic planning requires not just technical competence, but judgment, instinct, and the ability to make decisions when incomplete information and political pressure create impossible choices. It's not the kind of environment where theoretical knowledge or classroom excellence necessarily translates to real-world effectiveness. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were unmistakable. Her qualifications were being questioned, her readiness for this level of responsibility was in doubt, and her success would depend on proving herself according to standards that might shift depending on who was making the evaluation. Sarah met his gaze directly, her voice remaining steady despite the frustration building behind her professional facade. "I understand, General. I'm prepared to demonstrate my capabilities through my work." The first week at Strategic Operations Command passed in a blur of meetings where Sarah's presence was acknowledged but her expertise ignored. General Morrison had perfected the art of professional dismissal, creating an environment where her exclusion felt systematic rather than personal, bureaucratic rather than discriminatory. During daily briefings, he would ask for input from every officer except her, then conclude with comments like, "Of course, we'll need to bring Colonel Chen up to speed on these operational nuances as she settles into her coordination role." The coordination role itself proved to be a masterclass in strategic irrelevance. Sarah found herself managing information distribution systems that could have been handled by competent administrative staff, organizing briefing materials that she wasn't authorized to review in detail, and scheduling meetings for discussions where her presence wasn't required. Morrison had effectively created a position that kept her busy, visible, and completely removed from any decision-making process that actually mattered. Tuesday morning brought her first real assignment, coordinating logistical support for a classified training exercise involving special operations forces from 3 different branches. On the surface, it sounded significant. Multi-branch coordination required understanding complex command structures, resource allocation across different military cultures, and the ability to anticipate problems before they disrupted training schedules. In reality, Morrison had structured the assignment to ensure she handled only the administrative aspects, while Colonel Burke maintained control over all tactical and strategic elements. "Chen," Morrison announced during the morning briefing, his tone suggesting he was offering her a significant opportunity rather than relegating her to clerical work. "This exercise represents exactly the kind of complex coordination that makes or breaks strategic operations. You'll be working with representatives from Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and Marine reconnaissance units. Each branch has its own protocols, its own priorities, and its own way of interpreting orders. Your job is to make sure everyone gets the right information at the right time without creating conflicts between competing command structures." The assignment came with a thick folder of existing protocols, contact lists for personnel she'd never met, and timeline requirements that seemed designed more to test her ability to manage bureaucratic complexity than to evaluate her strategic thinking. Sarah reviewed the materials carefully, immediately recognizing inefficiencies in the current coordination system that could be streamlined with minor adjustments to communication protocols and resource distribution schedules. But when she attempted to discuss these observations with Morrison, he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Colonel Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but these protocols have been developed through years of successful operations. What we need from you right now is execution, not innovation. Learn the system first, understand how it works in practice, then perhaps we can discuss potential improvements." The dismissal was delivered with the kind of paternal tone that suggested her observations were naive rather than insightful, the product of inexperience rather than fresh perspective. Colonel Burke reinforced Morrison's message during their first one-on-one meeting, held in his office overlooking the Pentagon courtyard. Burke had built his reputation on successful operations in Iraq, where his ability to coordinate complex multi-unit missions had earned him a Bronze Star and the respect of senior leadership. His office walls displayed photographs from various deployments, commendations from grateful commanding officers, and a map of Afghanistan marked with locations where his strategic planning had contributed to successful operations. "Chun, I want to be direct with you," Burke said, settling behind his desk with the confident posture of someone accustomed to having his opinions taken seriously. "Strategic coordination at this level isn't about academic theory or textbook solutions. It's about understanding personalities, managing egos, and knowing when to push and when to step back. You've got impressive credentials, but credentials don't teach you how to handle a Navy SEAL commander who thinks Marine protocols are amateur hour, or how to convince an Army colonel that Special Forces timing requirements actually matter." The lecture continued for 20 minutes, covering topics that Sarah had been managing successfully for years in combat environments where personality conflicts could literally get people killed. Burke's assumption that she lacked practical experience with inter-service rivalry or ego management revealed how thoroughly her actual background had been dismissed in favor of assumptions about what her career path must have looked like. He spoke as if her combat deployments had been administrative assignments rather than leadership positions, where she'd successfully coordinated operations involving multiple branches under conditions far more challenging than training exercises. Sarah listened politely, taking notes that she knew Burke would interpret as evidence of her need for his guidance rather than her professional courtesy in receiving instruction from a superior officer. When he finished, she responded with appropriate appreciation for his mentorship, while internally cataloging the numerous factual errors in his assessment of inter-service coordination protocols. Burke's version of Navy SEAL operational preferences hadn't been accurate since 2018. His understanding of Marine reconnaissance capabilities was outdated by at least 5 years, and his assumptions about Army Special Forces command structure reflected changes that had been implemented while he was stationed in non-operational assignments. The pattern of exclusion extended beyond formal assignments into the informal networks that really controlled information flow in Strategic Operations Command. Coffee breaks happened without her, lunch conversations ended when she approached, and after-hours discussions about ongoing operations took place in venues where her presence would have been noticeable and awkward. Major Rodriguez occasionally shared relevant information, but always in brief, careful exchanges that couldn't be interpreted as alliance building or preferential treatment. Thursday brought Sarah's first exposure to the weekly strategic assessment meeting, where senior officers reviewed ongoing global situations and identified potential areas requiring American military response. Morrison introduced her as our new coordination specialist, here to observe and learn about the decision-making process at the strategic level. The introduction positioned her as a student rather than a contributor, someone whose presence was educational rather than operational. The meeting covered situations in 3 different regions where American interests were potentially threatened: terrorist activity in West Africa that might require special operations intervention, naval tensions in the South China Sea that could escalate into broader conflicts, and political instability in Eastern Europe that had implications for NATO alliance obligations. Each situation required understanding complex political dynamics, assessing military capabilities across multiple potential adversaries, and developing response options that balanced effectiveness with acceptable risk levels. Sarah recognized several factual errors in the intelligence briefings and identified strategic assumptions that her combat experience suggested were questionable. But Morrison's introduction had established her role as observer rather than participant. When Colonel Phillips, the intelligence liaison, described terrorist organizational structures in West Africa, Sarah noticed outdated information that conflicted with recent, classified reports she'd reviewed during her previous assignment. When General Morrison discussed naval capabilities in the South China Sea, his assessment overlooked technological developments that significantly altered the strategic balance in that region. Most frustrating was the discussion of potential special operations responses to the West African situation. Sarah had planned and executed similar operations during her second deployment, working directly with the kind of local forces and political structures that the strategic assessment was analyzing. Her experience included successful coordination with exactly the type of interagency partnerships that the current situation would require. But her observer status meant her knowledge remained unused while senior officers worked with incomplete information. Morrison concluded the meeting by assigning follow-up research to various officers, carefully distributing tasks based on each person's expertise and experience. Colonel Burke received responsibility for analyzing special operations requirements. Major Stevens was tasked with developing naval response options, and Captain Williams got assignment for political risk assessment. Sarah received nothing, as if her presence in the room had been purely educational rather than professional. The exclusion felt deliberate rather than accidental, a systematic demonstration that her role in Strategic Operations Command would be limited to administrative support regardless of her qualifications or relevant experience. Morrison was establishing a pattern where her contributions were neither sought nor welcomed, where her expertise was assumed to be insufficient for the level of analysis required at the strategic level. The systematic exclusion intensified over the following weeks as Morrison refined his approach to managing what he clearly viewed as an unwelcome political obligation. Sarah discovered that her access to classified briefing materials was inexplicably delayed, arriving on her desk hours after other officers had already reviewed and discussed the contents in informal meetings she wasn't invited to attend. When she requested clarification about the delays, Morrison's administrative assistant explained that security clearance verification was taking longer than usual, despite Sarah's clearance level being identical to or higher than most officers. In the command, the West African situation escalated during Sarah's third week, requiring immediate reassessment of American response options. Morrison called an emergency briefing for 0800 hours, sending notification emails to the entire strategic planning team, except Sarah. She only learned about the meeting when Major Rodriguez mentioned it in passing while they waited for coffee in the commissary. "You might want to check your email," Rodriguez said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Morrison's calling an emergency session about the terrorist situation. Seems like intelligence has identified an imminent threat." Sarah rushed back to her office and found the meeting notification buried in her spam folder, a technical glitch that seemed remarkably convenient given the timing. She arrived at conference room Alpha 7 15 minutes late to find 12 officers, deep in tactical discussion about potential rescue operations for American civilians trapped in a compound outside Bamako. Morrison paused the briefing as she entered, his expression suggesting irritation at the interruption rather than concern about her absence from critical planning. "Colonel Chen, glad you could join us," Morrison said with the kind of exaggerated politeness that highlighted her tardiness. "We're discussing immediate response options for the Mali situation. Take a seat and try to catch up." The comment drew knowing looks from several officers who understood that arriving late to emergency briefings was typically career-damaging, regardless of the circumstances that caused the delay. Sarah listened as Colonel Burke outlined a rescue operation that would require coordination between special operations forces, local military units, and civilian evacuation teams. His plan was methodical and thorough, but it overlooked several critical factors that Sarah recognized from her own experience with similar operations in Afghanistan. The timeline Burke proposed didn't account for seasonal weather patterns that would affect helicopter operations. His intelligence assessment missed key tribal alliances that could either facilitate or complicate military movement. And his evacuation routes ignored recent infrastructure damage that would force significant tactical adjustments. When Morrison opened the floor for questions and suggestions, Sarah raised her hand and waited for acknowledgement. "Colonel Chen, you have input?" Morrison asked, his tone suggesting surprise that someone in a coordination role would have tactical insights worth sharing. "General, I have experience with similar rescue operations in mountainous terrain with comparable tribal dynamics," Sarah began carefully. "The seasonal weather patterns in that region create significant helicopter operation challenges between now and December. The monsoon season affects visibility and landing zone stability in ways that could compromise extraction timing. Additionally, recent tribal conflicts have shifted alliance structures that might impact our ability to coordinate with local military forces." Morrison's expression shifted from surprise to skepticism as Sarah continued. "Colonel Burke's plan is solid, but we might want to consider alternative extraction routes that account for the bridge destruction near Katy, and possibly adjust our timeline to work with rather than against the weather patterns that local forces understand better than our intelligence reports suggest." The room fell silent as senior officers processed the fact that their coordination specialist was offering tactical corrections to plans developed by experienced combat commanders. Burke's face flushed with obvious irritation at having his expertise questioned by someone he'd explicitly positioned as a subordinate, learning the basics of strategic coordination. "Colonel Chen," Morrison said slowly, his voice carrying a warning tone that everyone in the room recognized, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but tactical planning at this level requires understanding political implications that go beyond operational considerations. Colonel Burke's plan has been reviewed by intelligence specialists with decades of regional experience. Perhaps your coordination role would be better served by ensuring that communication protocols are properly established rather than second-guessing strategic decisions made by officers with proven track records in these environments." The dismissal was comprehensive and public, designed not just to shut down Sarah's input, but to establish clear boundaries about her role in future discussions. Around the table, officers studiously avoided eye contact, understanding that they were witnessing a demonstration of how Morrison handled challenges to the established hierarchy. Colonel Burke reinforced Morrison's message with barely concealed satisfaction. "Chen, strategic planning isn't about applying textbook knowledge to real-world situations. Every operation has unique variables that require experience-based judgment rather than academic analysis. Your job is to make sure the right people get the right information, not to evaluate decisions made by officers who've been managing these situations since before you completed basic training." The comment was factually inaccurate. Sarah had been commissioned several years before Burke, but challenging it would only reinforce their perception that she was argumentative rather than collaborative. She nodded professionally and returned to taking notes, but internally cataloged yet another instance where her relevant expertise was dismissed in favor of assumptions about her experience level and appropriate role. The pattern continued throughout the following days as the Mali operation moved from planning to execution. Sarah's coordination responsibilities involved managing communication between Pentagon decision-makers and field commanders, but she was systematically excluded from the analytical discussions that shaped how information was interpreted and presented to senior leadership. When field reports contradicted aspects of Burke's original assessment, Morrison's team adjusted their analysis without acknowledging that Sarah's initial concerns had been accurate. The operation ultimately succeeded, but required exactly the kind of timeline and route modification Sarah had suggested. American civilians were evacuated safely, but only after weather delays forced helicopter crews to adapt to monsoon conditions that could have been anticipated with better regional analysis. Local tribal dynamics created coordination challenges that slowed the operation by 6 hours, requiring emergency protocol adjustments that field commanders implemented based on their own knowledge rather than Pentagon guidance. Morrison's after-action Briefing praised Burke's flexible leadership and the team's ability to adapt to unexpected complications, without mentioning that many of those complications had been predictable based on information Sarah had tried to provide. The successful outcome was presented as validation of their strategic planning process, rather than evidence that alternative perspectives might have improved. Initial preparations. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated from the informal networks, where real information sharing occurred. Evening gatherings at the Officers' Club happened without her knowledge. Weekend golf games included strategic planning discussions she wasn't part of, and casual conversations in hallways stopped when she approached. Major Rodriguez continued to provide occasional information, but their interactions became increasingly careful as Rodriguez clearly understood that supporting Sarah too openly might damage her own position. The isolation extended to practical matters that affected her ability to perform even her limited coordination duties effectively. Meeting schedules changed without notification, briefing materials arrived incomplete or outdated, and requests for clarification received delayed responses that often missed critical deadlines. When Sarah asked Morrison's administrative staff about these issues, she was told that operational tempo was creating unavoidable delays in communication, despite other officers receiving timely information about the same matters. Lieutenant Colonel David Park, Morrison's strategic planning director, began scheduling planning sessions during times when Sarah had other assigned duties, ensuring that tactical discussions happened without her presence, while maintaining plausible deniability. About the exclusion. When she requested copies of meeting minutes or briefing summaries, Park explained that security protocols limited distribution of sensitive planning documents to essential personnel only. The cumulative effect was professionally suffocating and personally demoralizing. Sarah had entered Strategic Operations Command expecting to contribute her expertise to critical national security decisions, but found herself managing administrative tasks while watching her knowledge and experience be systematically discounted. Every day brought new examples of how her presence was tolerated rather than valued, managed rather than utilized. More frustrating than the professional limitations was the growing realization that Morrison's treatment of her was affecting how other officers perceived her capabilities and contributions. Younger staff members began treating her as an administrative coordinator rather than a strategic planning officer, requesting help with scheduling and document preparation rather than seeking tactical input or analytical collaboration. The breaking point came during a classified briefing about Operation Sahel Shield, a proposed multinational intervention in Chad, where French forces had requested American logistical support for a counter-terrorism operation targeting Islamic State affiliates. Sarah sat in her usual position at the far end of the conference table, taking notes on communication protocols while Morrison and his senior staff discussed deployment timelines that would affect thousands of American service members over the next 6 months. Colonel Burke had developed an ambitious support plan involving 3 airlift squadrons, 2 special operations detachments, and a forward logistics base that would require coordination between American forces and French military units whose operational methods differed significantly from NATO standards. His presentation covered supply chain management, personnel rotation schedules, and equipment maintenance protocols with the kind of detailed precision that impressed senior leadership and demonstrated mastery of complex logistical challenges. Sarah noticed immediately that Burke's plan contained a fundamental flaw that could prove catastrophic under combat conditions. The proposed logistics base location was positioned in terrain that became impassable during seasonal flooding, which occurred precisely during the time frame when French forces would need maximum support for their primary assault operations. Burke's intelligence briefing materials showed satellite imagery from the dry season, presenting ground conditions that wouldn't exist when American forces actually needed to use the facility. The error wasn't subtle or debatable. It was the kind of basic geographical oversight that could strand American personnel in hostile territory without supplies, medical evacuation capabilities, or tactical support when they needed it most. Sarah had conducted similar operations in Afghanistan during monsoon seasons, had seen how seasonal weather patterns could transform tactical situations overnight, and understood exactly how dangerous it was to plan logistics operations based on incomplete environmental analysis. She raised her hand and waited for acknowledgement, knowing that challenging Burke's presentation would violate the informal protocols Morrison had established for her participation in strategic discussions. But this wasn't about professional courtesy or career advancement. This was about preventing a planning error that could get American soldiers killed. "General Morrison," Sarah said when he finally nodded in her direction, "I need to raise a concern about the proposed logistics base location." The room immediately fell silent as 12 senior officers turned to stare at their coordination specialist, who was apparently about to challenge tactical planning decisions made by one of Morrison's most trusted subordinates. Morrison's expression shifted from surprise to irritation as he realized that Sarah was going to disrupt the smooth flow of his briefing with questions that implied criticism of Burke's work. "Colonel Chen, is this about communication protocols or supply chain management? Because if it's a coordination issue, we can address it after the main briefing." "Sir, it's about the base location itself," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the hostile attention focused on her. "The proposed site becomes completely inaccessible during seasonal flooding that occurs from August through October. The satellite imagery in Colonel Burke's briefing shows dry season conditions, but during the time frame when French forces will need maximum logistical support, our base would be cut off from supply routes and evacuation corridors." Colonel Burke's face flushed red as he realized that their newest team member was publicly questioning his tactical competence in front of senior leadership. "Colonel Chen, with respect, the intelligence analysis was conducted by experts who understand regional conditions better than you do. The site was selected based on multiple factors including security, accessibility, and strategic positioning relative to anticipated operational areas." Sarah opened her notebook and retrieved the environmental assessment data she'd researched after reviewing Burke's preliminary briefing materials 3 days earlier. "Sir, I've reviewed meteorological data from the past 15 years. The proposed location floods to depths of 3 to 6 feet annually during the rainy season. The access roads become impassable, helicopter landing zones turn into muddy swamps, and ground vehicle movement becomes impossible. During the exact months when French forces will be conducting their primary operations, our logistics base would be effectively isolated." The room erupted in uncomfortable tension as senior officers processed the implications of what Sarah was saying. If she was correct, Burke's entire operational plan was based on faulty assumptions that could compromise not just American support capabilities, but French operational success and the safety of personnel from both nations. Morrison's voice carried dangerous undertones when he responded. "Colonel Chen, you're making serious accusations about the competence of strategic planning conducted by experienced officers with proven track records. Are you suggesting that Colonel Burke and his team failed to conduct basic environmental analysis for a major operational deployment?" The question was clearly designed to force Sarah into an impossible position. Either back down and apologize for questioning her superiors, or double down on accusations that could be interpreted as insubordination worthy of disciplinary action. Every person in the room understood that Morrison was offering her one opportunity to retreat gracefully before the situation escalated beyond repair. Sarah looked around the table at faces that ranged from sympathetic discomfort to open hostility, understanding that her next words would define not just this moment, but her entire future at Strategic Operations Command. She could apologize, claim misunderstanding, and return to her coordination role with even less credibility than before. Or she could stand behind analysis that she knew was accurate regardless of the personal consequences. General Morrison. I'm not questioning anyone's competence, Sarah said carefully. I'm identifying a potential operational hazard based on environmental data that doesn't appear to have been considered in the current planning process. The meteorological information is publicly available from multiple sources, including NOAA, French Meteorological Services, and Chad's National Weather Bureau. The flooding pattern is consistent and predictable, occurring annually during the same seasonal time frame. She opened her tablet and displayed satellite imagery showing the proposed base location during previous rainy seasons. The access roads underwater, the landing zones transformed into swamps, and the entire area rendered completely unusable for military operations. This isn't speculation or theoretical analysis. This is documented evidence of conditions that will exist during our proposed deployment period. Burke shot to his feet, his military bearing radiating outrage at having his professional judgment challenged by someone he'd consistently treated as an administrative subordinate. Colonel Chen, you're way out of line here. You're suggesting that myself, my planning staff, and Pentagon intelligence analysts all missed basic environmental factors that should have been obvious to anyone conducting proper operational preparation. That's not constructive criticism. That's accusation of professional incompetence. Morrison seized the moment to establish clear consequences for Sarah's challenge to established authority. Colonel Chen, this kind of grandstanding is exactly what I was concerned about when you joined this team. Strategic planning requires collaborative teamwork, not individual attempts to demonstrate superior knowledge at the expense of unit cohesion. Your role here is coordination, not tactical analysis, and this kind of behavior suggests you don't understand appropriate boundaries for your position. The public rebuke was designed to humiliate Sarah while reinforcing Morrison's control over strategic discussions, but it also revealed the fundamental problem with how Strategic Operations Command approached decision-making. Morrison was more concerned with maintaining hierarchy and avoiding embarrassment than with ensuring operational accuracy, even when American lives were potentially at stake. Sarah felt anger building behind her professional facade as she realized that Morrison would rather proceed with flawed planning than acknowledge that his coordination specialist had identified serious problems with his tactical team's work. This wasn't about her career or her position in the command structure. This was about military leaders choosing ego over effectiveness when soldiers' lives hung in the balance. General Morrison, she said, her voice carrying new steel that made several officers sit up straighter. With respect, this isn't about boundaries or teamwork. This is about preventing American service members from being stranded without supplies or evacuation capabilities because of planning based on incomplete environmental analysis. If we deploy logistic support to that location during rainy season, people are going to die unnecessarily. The confrontation's aftermath rippled through Strategic Operations Command, like a shockwave through a carefully constructed hierarchy. Morrison dismissed the briefing immediately after Sarah's final comment, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury as he announced that operational planning would resume the following morning, after certain coordination issues had been resolved. The phrase carried unmistakable implications about who was responsible for disrupting the smooth functioning of his command. Sarah returned to her office knowing that she had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. Morrison's administrative assistant appeared within an hour, carrying a formal memo scheduling a disciplinary meeting for the following afternoon, along with instructions to prepare a written explanation for her inappropriate disruption of strategic planning processes. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the fact that her career at Strategic Operations Command was probably over before it had really begun. But surrender wasn't in Sarah's vocabulary, and the prospect of disciplinary action only strengthened her resolve to prove that her analysis was correct. She spent the evening conducting exhaustive research into Chad's meteorological patterns, geological surveys of the proposed base location, and historical analysis of military operations conducted in similar terrain during comparable weather conditions. The evidence supported her position so overwhelming that she began to wonder how Burke's planning team could have missed such obvious environmental hazards. The answer came when she accessed archived intelligence reports from previous operations in the region. Burke's team had relied primarily on intelligence assessments conducted during dry season reconnaissance missions, supplemented by satellite imagery taken during months when weather conditions were optimal for visual observation. Nobody had bothered to examine meteorological data spanning multiple years, check historical flooding patterns, or consult with officers who had experience conducting operations in similar climates. More disturbing was Sarah's discovery that this wasn't an isolated oversight. Review of Strategic Operations Command's recent planning documents revealed a pattern of environmental analysis that consistently favored optimistic scenarios over comprehensive risk assessment. Operations in Syria had proceeded with insufficient analysis of seasonal dust storms that grounded aircraft for days. Afghanistan deployments had underestimated winter weather impacts on supply convoys. Somalia interventions had failed to account for monsoon effects on coastal landing operations. The pattern suggested systemic problems with how Morrison's team approached tactical planning, prioritizing speed and confidence over thorough analysis, emphasizing political considerations over operational realities. Sarah began to understand that her confrontation with Burke wasn't really about one flawed base location. It was about challenging an institutional culture that valued consensus and authority over accuracy and effectiveness. Major Rodriguez found Sarah in the research library at 2,100 hours, surrounded by meteorological reports, geological surveys, and operational histories spanning the past decade. "Chen, what are you trying to prove here?" Rodriguez asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Morrison's already made his decision about your future." Digging deeper into Burke's planning isn't going to change anything except make your disciplinary hearing worse. Sarah looked up from a French military report detailing logistics challenges during the 2019 Mali intervention, where seasonal flooding had created exactly the kind of problems she'd predicted for the Chad operation. "Linda, look at this data. The French lost 2 forward operating bases during their last major operation because seasonal flooding cut off supply lines, exactly like what Burke's planning. This isn't theoretical analysis. This is documented operational history that directly applies to our current situation." Rodriguez examined the French reports, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she realized the implications of what Sarah had discovered. "Jesus, Chen, if you're right about this, Burke's plan could strand American forces in hostile territory without evacuation routes. Why hasn't anyone else seen these reports?" "Because nobody looked," Sarah replied grimly. Burke's team conducted their analysis using intelligence sources that confirmed their initial assumptions rather than challenging them. They found data that supported the plan they wanted to implement rather than data that revealed potential problems with that plan. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Williams, Morrison's intelligence liaison, who seemed surprised to find 2 officers researching operational histories in the library after hours. Williams was young, ambitious, and absolutely loyal to Morrison's leadership style, making him exactly the kind of officer who would report unusual behavior to senior leadership. "Ladies, working late on special projects?" Williams asked with the casual curiosity that barely concealed his interest in what they were discussing. "Hope you're not burning the midnight oil on coordination protocols, Chen. Tomorrow's disciplinary hearing should be interesting enough without additional complications." Sarah and Rodriguez exchanged glances, understanding that Williams' presence was probably not coincidental. Morrison's network included officers who monitored informal activities and reported anything that might indicate disloyalty or insubordination. Research sessions in the library could easily be interpreted as attempts to build cases against superior officers or gather ammunition for grievance procedures. "Just catching up on regional background information," Sarah replied neutrally. "Coordination. Duties require understanding operational contexts, so I'm reviewing historical precedents for similar deployments." Williams nodded with the kind of exaggerated understanding that suggested he didn't believe a word of her explanation. "Smart approach, Chen. Context is everything in strategic planning. I'm sure General Morrison will appreciate your dedication to understanding how coordination responsibilities fit into broader operational frameworks." After Williams departed, Rodriguez gathered the French reports and handed them back to Sarah with obvious reluctance. "Chen, you need to be very careful about how you handle this information. Morrison's not going to change his mind about Burke's plan just because you found evidence that supports your position. But he might decide that you're actively undermining command authority by conducting independent research into classified operational planning." Sarah understood the warning but couldn't abandon her conviction that American lives were at stake. She spent the rest of the evening compiling a comprehensive analysis of environmental risks associated with the proposed Chad deployment, including meteorological data, geological assessments, historical flooding patterns, and documented examples of similar operations that had failed due to inadequate environmental planning. The analysis revealed problems far more extensive than the seasonal flooding issue she'd raised during Burke's briefing. The proposed logistics base was located in a seismically active region where earthquake activity could damage facilities and disrupt supply operations. Local water sources were contaminated with industrial pollutants that could affect personnel health during extended deployments. Transportation infrastructure was deteriorating faster than intelligence reports suggested, potentially limiting evacuation options if operations went wrong. Most significantly, Sarah discovered that Chad's political situation was more unstable than Strategic Operations Command's briefings indicated. Recent tribal conflicts had shifted alliance structures in ways that could affect local cooperation with American forces. Government military units that Burke's plan depended on for security support had been weakened by defections and equipment shortages. The operational environment was far more dangerous and unpredictable than Morrison's team understood. By dawn, Sarah had assembled evidence that Burke's planning contained not just one serious oversight but multiple critical flaws that could jeopardize the entire operation. But she also understood that presenting this information during her disciplinary hearing would be interpreted as defiance rather than dedication, insubordination rather than professionalism. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer from Afghanistan, who had somehow learned about Sarah's situation at Strategic Operations Command. "Heard through channels that you're having challenges in your new assignment. If you need someone to review your position or provide perspective, I'm available. Some battles are worth fighting regardless of personal cost." The message reminded Sarah that she wasn't completely isolated in her struggle against Morrison's institutional prejudices. Hayes had been one of the few senior officers who had consistently supported Sarah's advancement based on merit rather than political considerations, and her offer of assistance suggested that news of Morrison's treatment was spreading through military networks where his reputation was less unassailable than he assumed. Sarah realized that her disciplinary hearing might be more than just a career-ending formality. If she presented her case effectively, if she focused on operational effectiveness rather than personal grievances, she might be able to expose systematic problems with Strategic Operations Command's decision-making processes that extended far beyond her individual situation. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating, because success would require challenging, not just Morrison's authority but the entire institutional culture that valued hierarchy over accuracy, consensus over competence. But failure would mean more than just ending her career. It would mean allowing flawed planning to proceed when she knew it could cost American lives. The disciplinary hearing never happened. At 05:45 hours on Tuesday morning, Sarah's phone exploded with emergency notifications as the Chad operation collapsed into a catastrophic disaster that would dominate Pentagon crisis management for the next 72 hours. French forces had initiated their assault against Islamic State positions precisely as planned, but the American logistics base that was supposed to support their operation was already underwater, transformed into an impassable swamp exactly as Sarah had predicted during her confrontation with Burke. The initial reports filtering through Strategic Operations Command were fragmentary and alarming. Communication lost with forward operating base Gecko. Supply convoys unable to reach their designated coordinates. Helicopter evacuation missions grounded due to impossible landing conditions. What had been planned as a textbook special operations support mission was rapidly becoming a humanitarian crisis involving 37 American service members stranded without supplies, medical support, or extraction capabilities. Morrison's confident command presence evaporated as situation reports painted an increasingly desperate picture of American forces trapped in hostile territory during the worst flooding in 15 years. The satellite imagery that Burke's team had used for planning showed dry, accessible terrain that bore no resemblance to the muddy wasteland where American logistics personnel were now fighting for survival against rising water levels and increasingly aggressive enemy forces who understood that isolated Americans represented high-value targets. Emergency briefings convened every 2 hours as Morrison's staff struggled to develop extraction options for personnel who were beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations. Colonel Burke's face had gone ashen as he realized that his tactical planning had created exactly the kind of operational nightmare that ended military careers and congressional investigations. The base location he'd selected with such confidence was not just inaccessible. It was becoming a death trap for soldiers who had trusted his judgment with their lives. French military commanders were reporting their own communication difficulties as they attempted to coordinate with American support elements that simply weren't where they were supposed to be. The multinational operation that was intended to demonstrate seamless cooperation between allied forces was instead showcasing catastrophic planning failures that threatened to undermine NATO relationships and American credibility in future joint operations. By Wednesday afternoon, the situation had escalated beyond tactical crisis into potential international incident. Chadian government forces were demanding explanations for American military personnel operating in unauthorized locations. French commanders were questioning American competence in basic logistics planning, and Pentagon leadership was asking pointed questions about how Strategic Operations Command had approved deployment plans that ignored fundamental environmental realities. Morrison called an emergency strategy session with his senior staff, but the discussion quickly devolved into desperate improvisation rather than systematic problem-solving. Traditional extraction methods were impossible due to weather conditions that wouldn't improve for weeks. Alternative supply routes were controlled by hostile forces who had quickly recognized American vulnerability. Diplomatic solutions were complicated by the fact that American forces were essentially trespassing in areas where they weren't supposed to be operating. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We need options, people, Morrison announced to his assembled staff, his usual commanding presence replaced by barely controlled panic. 37 American service members are depending on us to get them home alive, and every conventional extraction method is either impossible or unacceptably dangerous. What do we have? Colonel Burke presented a series of increasingly desperate proposals. High-risk helicopter insertions that weather services predicted would fail. Overland rescue convoys that would require fighting through hostile territory. Diplomatic negotiations with local militia groups who had no incentive to cooperate. Each option carried casualty probabilities that made senior leadership uncomfortable with authorization. Yet doing nothing guaranteed that American personnel would die from exposure, enemy action, or medical emergencies that couldn't be treated. In their current circumstances, Major Rodriguez raised the possibility of coordinating with French special forces to establish alternative supply lines. But French commanders were dealing with their own operational complications created by the absence of expected American logistical support. The multinational cooperation that was supposed to be the operation's greatest strength had become its most significant weakness as both nations struggled with problems created by flawed American planning. Captain Williams suggested requesting support from other regional allies, but neighboring countries had limited capabilities for the kind of complex extraction operation that current conditions would require. Chad's military was already overwhelmed by their own commitments. Major's forces lacked equipment for operations in flooded terrain, and international organizations were reluctant to risk personnel for what appeared to be an American planning failure. The discussion continued for hours without producing viable solutions, as Morrison's staff confronted the reality that conventional military doctrine had no answers for the unique combination of challenges facing trapped American forces. Environmental conditions, hostile territory, diplomatic complications, and operational security requirements had created a tactical puzzle that traditional approaches couldn't solve. Sarah sat in her designated corner, officially present as a coordination specialist but effectively ignored as senior officers debated options that her research had already revealed would fail. She listened to proposals that ignored geographical realities, tactical assessments that overlooked enemy capabilities, and extraction plans that assumed weather conditions would improve according to optimistic projections rather than actual meteorological data. The irony was overwhelming. The same environmental analysis that Morrison had dismissed as inappropriate interference was now the key to understanding why rescue operations were failing and what alternatives might actually work. Sarah had spent days researching exactly the kind of information that could save American lives, but her position in Morrison's hierarchy meant her knowledge remained unused while desperate improvisation replaced systematic planning. As the afternoon wore on, situation reports from Forward Operating Base Gecko became increasingly urgent. Medical emergencies were developing among personnel who lacked adequate shelter from monsoon conditions. Food supplies were running dangerously low because planned resupply missions couldn't reach their destination. Enemy probing attacks were increasing as hostile forces recognized American vulnerability and began positioning for more aggressive action. Time was running out for solutions that could prevent the stranded operation from becoming a massacre that would haunt American military leadership for decades. Morrison's staff had exhausted conventional options without finding approaches that balanced effectiveness with acceptable risk levels. The Pentagon was demanding immediate action, but every proposed action carried prohibitive casualty estimates. That made authorization politically and morally impossible. Sarah realized that she was watching institutional failure in real time, as hierarchical decision-making processes proved incapable of responding effectively to crises that required unconventional thinking and comprehensive environmental analysis. Morrison's command structure, which functioned effectively during routine operations, was paralyzed by problems that demanded exactly the kind of innovative tactical thinking that his exclusionary leadership style had systematically discouraged. Trapped American forces needed rescue operations, planned by someone who understood regional geography, seasonal weather patterns, tribal political dynamics, and unconventional extraction methodologies. They needed strategic thinking that combined military tactics with anthropological insights, environmental science with diplomatic considerations. They needed exactly the kind of comprehensive analytical approach that Sarah had been developing. While Morrison's staff dismissed her contributions as coordination, busy work, But speaking up now would require more than just tactical expertise. It would require challenging Morrison's authority when his command was already under scrutiny for catastrophic planning failures. Success would save American lives but probably end her military career. Failure would confirm Morrison's assessment that she was unsuited for strategic leadership responsibilities. The choice was becoming unavoidable. Watch American service members die to protect her own position, or risk everything to provide the unconventional solutions that conventional military thinking couldn't generate. Sarah stood up from her corner chair with a decisiveness that cut through the desperate murmuring of officers who had run out of viable options. The movement drew immediate attention from Morrison and his staff, who turned to stare at their coordination specialist as if she'd materialized from thin air. For weeks they had treated her as background furniture, present but irrelevant to serious strategic discussions. Now, with American lives hanging in the balance and conventional solutions exhausted, her presence commanded the room in ways that rank and protocol had never achieved. "General Morrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision, "I have a solution for extracting our personnel from forward operating base Gecko." The statement landed like a physical blow in a room where senior officers had just spent 6 hours failing to develop workable rescue options. Morrison's expression shifted from surprise to irritation as he processed the fact that his marginalized coordination specialist was offering tactical advice when his most experienced commanders had admitted defeat. "Colonel Chen, this isn't the time for theoretical contributions," Morrison replied sharply. "We need practical solutions from officers with operational experience in these conditions. Your coordination responsibilities don't include rescue planning." Sarah opened her tablet and displayed detailed topographical maps overlaid with meteorological data, tribal territory boundaries, and alternative transportation routes that none of Morrison's staff had considered. "Sir, I've identified 3 extraction corridors that remain passable during current flooding conditions. The approach requires coordination with local fishing communities who have boats capable of navigating flooded terrain, combined with helicopter operations from elevated positions that aren't shown in standard military mapping systems." Colonel Burke leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced by desperate interest despite his obvious reluctance to accept tactical advice from someone whose expertise he'd consistently dismissed. "Shun, those areas are controlled by hostile tribal groups. We can't coordinate with civilians in active combat zones." Colonel Burke, the tribal groups controlling those areas have been fighting Islamic State forces longer than we have. Sarah responded, her analysis drawing from anthropological research that conventional military intelligence had overlooked. "They're not hostile to American forces. They're suspicious of foreign military operations that don't coordinate with local authority structures. The difference matters when you're planning extraction operations that depend on local cooperation." She manipulated her tablet display to show population centers, tribal boundaries, and political relationships that standard military maps didn't include. "The fishing communities in this region have been using seasonal flood routes for transportation for centuries. They know exactly how to navigate conditions that ground our helicopters and strand our vehicles. More importantly, they have economic incentives to cooperate with operations that reduce Islamic State presence in their territory." Morrison stared at the detailed analysis appearing on Sarah's screen, information that his intelligence staff had either missed or dismissed as irrelevant to military planning. The map showed alternative routes, local resources, and strategic relationships that could transform an impossible rescue into a manageable operation. But accepting Sarah's assessment would require acknowledging that his coordination specialist understood regional dynamics better than his senior tactical planners. Major Rodriguez broke the tension by asking the question everyone was thinking. "Sean, how do you know all this? This level of analysis isn't in any of our intelligence briefings." Sarah's Response revealed the depth of preparation that Morrison's staff had dismissed as administrative busywork. I've been researching regional dynamics since Colonel Burke's initial Chad briefing. Cultural anthropology, economic relationships, seasonal transportation patterns, tribal political structures. The information exists in academic sources, NGO reports, and French military archives that American intelligence doesn't routinely access. The admission hung in the air like an indictment of Strategic Operations Command's analytical methods. While Morrison's team had relied on standard military intelligence sources, Sarah had conducted comprehensive research that revealed crucial information about local capabilities and political relationships that could make the difference between successful extraction and catastrophic failure. Captain Williams challenged her analysis with obvious skepticism. Colonel Chen, even if local fishing boats could navigate flooded areas, how do we coordinate complex operations with civilian groups that don't use military communication systems? How do we establish security protocols with people who don't understand operational security requirements? Sarah's response demonstrated tactical thinking that went far beyond coordination responsibilities. We don't need them to understand operational security, Captain. We need to understand their operational capabilities. Local fishing communities have VHF radio networks for coordinating daily activities. They use GPS systems for navigation. They have established protocols for avoiding dangerous areas and responding to emergencies. We adapt our communication methods to their systems instead of requiring them to adapt to ours. She continued building her case with the systematic precision that had earned her combat decorations. In Afghanistan, the extraction operation requires 3 phases. First, helicopter insertion of a coordination team to elevated positions where they can establish communication with fishing communities and confirm route accessibility. Second, boat-based transportation of personnel from forward operating base Gecko to helicopter landing zones on higher ground. Third, medical evacuation and extraction flights from secure areas outside the flood zone. Morrison studied Sarah's proposed timeline, coordination requirements, and resource allocation with growing recognition that her plan addressed challenges his staff hadn't solved. But accepting her solution would require abandoning hierarchical decision-making in favor of expertise-based leadership, acknowledging that tactical competence mattered more than position or precedent. Colonel Chen, Morrison said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would define his command's effectiveness. This operation would require coordination with civilian populations, navigation in hostile territory during severe weather conditions, and tactical flexibility that isn't covered in standard operating procedures. Are you prepared to take operational responsibility for planning and executing these extractions? The question was both an offer and a test, giving Sarah the opportunity to assume leadership responsibilities she'd been denied while making her personally accountable for outcomes that could save or condemn American lives. Success would vindicate her expertise and transform her position in Strategic Operations Command. Failure would confirm Morrison's assessment that she was unsuited for strategic leadership responsibilities. Sarah met Morrison's gaze directly, her response carrying the confidence of someone who had already calculated risks and accepted consequences. Yes, General. I'll take full operational responsibility for the extraction plan. But I'll need authorization to coordinate directly with French commanders, access to communication equipment for coordinating with local civilian groups, and helicopter assets configured for operations in extreme weather conditions. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that he was authorizing the most unconventional rescue operation in his command's history, led by the officer he'd consistently marginalized as administratively competent but tactically inexperienced. Colonel Chen, you have full operational authority for this extraction mission. Colonel Burke will provide logistical support under your direction. Major Rodriguez will handle communication coordination. Make it work. Sarah immediately began issuing orders with the natural authority of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis leadership. Colonel Burke, I need helicopter crews with experience in mountain rescue operations and extreme weather flying. Major Rodriguez, establish communication links with French commanders and brief them on coordination requirements for joint civilian-military operations. Captain Williams, contact our embassy in Chad and request liaison support for coordinating with local government officials. The room transformed as Morrison's staff shifted from desperate improvisation to systematic execution under Sarah's direction. Officers who had dismissed her coordination role now found themselves implementing her tactical vision, following her strategic guidance, and depending on her expertise to save American lives. The rescue operation Sarah commanded over the next 18 hours would become a textbook example of unconventional tactical thinking, innovative resource utilization, and cultural intelligence applied to military crisis management. But more than tactical success, it would demonstrate that effective leadership emerged from competence rather than hierarchy, that strategic thinking required diverse perspectives rather than institutional conformity. The extraction operation unfolded with the precision of a complex symphony conducted by someone who understood every instrument in the orchestra. Sarah's coordination with local fishing communities proceeded exactly as she had predicted. Experienced boat operators who knew seasonal flood patterns better than any satellite imagery, VHF radio networks that enabled real-time communication between scattered rescue teams, and navigation expertise that allowed safe passage through territory that had defeated conventional military transportation methods. French Special Forces commanders initially expressed skepticism about coordinating rescue operations with civilian fishing boats, but their doubts evaporated when local operators demonstrated capabilities that surpassed military expectations. Chadian fishermen navigated flooded terrain with confidence that came from generations of experience, reached forward operating base Gecko through routes that military planners had considered impossible, and evacuated American personnel with efficiency that impressed even veteran special operations officers. The helicopter operations Sarah coordinated from elevated landing zones proceeded without a single accident despite weather conditions that grounded most military aviation in the region. Her selection of alternative landing sites, based on geological surveys that Burke's team had never consulted, provided secure extraction points that remained accessible throughout the rescue timeline. Medical evacuation flights transported injured personnel to appropriate treatment facilities, while maintaining operational security that protected both American forces and local civilian populations. By Thursday evening, all 37 American service members had been successfully extracted from forward operating base Gecko without casualties, enemy contact, or diplomatic complications. The operation that Morrison's staff had considered impossible had been completed less than 24 hours through tactical innovation that combined military expertise with anthropological insights, technological capabilities with cultural intelligence. Pentagon leadership reacted to the successful extraction with a mixture of relief and amazement that rapidly evolved into institutional recognition for exceptional operational planning. News of the unconventional rescue spread through military command structures where Sarah's tactical thinking was analyzed, discussed, and praised as an example of innovative leadership under extreme pressure conditions. Within a week, Strategic Operations Command received official commendations from French military leadership, grateful acknowledgement from Chadian government officials, and requests from other Pentagon departments for Sarah's expertise in planning future operations involving civilian-military coordination. The rescue operation had transformed a potential international incident into a demonstration of American tactical flexibility and cultural competence. Morrison's attitude towards Sarah underwent a complete reversal that reflected his grudging recognition that she possessed exactly the kind of strategic thinking capabilities his command needed. The officer he had systematically marginalized as administratively useful, but tactically inexperienced had demonstrated leadership skills that surpassed those of his most experienced subordinates. His attempts to maintain hierarchical authority had nearly resulted in catastrophic failure, while Sarah's expertise had prevented a disaster that could have ended multiple military careers. Colonel Burke approached Sarah privately to offer an apology that revealed the depth of his professional reassessment. "Chen, I owe you more than just an apology. I let my ego and assumptions override tactical judgment, and my planning failures could have gotten people killed. Your expertise saved lives that my incompetence put at risk. That's not something I'll forget or repeat." The recognition extended beyond personal relationships into official acknowledgement that culminated in Sarah's selection for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor and exceptional service. The nomination process moved with unusual speed as Pentagon leadership recognized the rescue operations strategic significance and the innovative leadership that had made success possible under seemingly impossible conditions. The official ceremony was scheduled for the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, with senior military leadership from all branches present to witness the presentation of an award that represented the highest recognition American military institutions could provide. Media coverage would highlight Sarah's tactical innovation, her breakthrough in civilian-military coordination, and her demonstration that unconventional thinking could solve problems that traditional military doctrine couldn't address. But when Secretary of Defense Patricia Harrison called Sarah into her office 3 days before the ceremony to discuss the presentation details, Sarah's response shocked the entire Pentagon leadership structure. She declined the Medal of Honor with quiet dignity that left senior officials struggling to understand her reasoning. "Madam Secretary," Sarah said with respectful firmness, "I cannot accept the Medal of Honor for this operation." Secretary Harrison stared at Sarah in disbelief, processing the unprecedented situation of an officer refusing America's highest military decoration. "Colonel Chen, I don't think you understand the significance of this recognition. The Medal of Honor represents acknowledgement by the entire military establishment that your actions exemplified the highest standards of American military service." Sarah's response revealed thinking that went far beyond personal recognition or career advancement. "Madam Secretary, with respect, that's exactly why I cannot accept this award. The same military establishment that wants to honor me for saving American lives spent months systematically ignoring the expertise that made this rescue possible. The operation succeeded not because the system worked, but because the system failed so completely that someone had to circumvent institutional prejudices to prevent catastrophic losses." The words carried implications that reached into the fundamental assumptions underlying military leadership and recognition systems. Sarah was challenging not just individual prejudices, but institutional structures that valued hierarchy over competence, conformity over innovation. Secretary Harrison, 37 American service members are alive today because I refuse to accept that my expertise didn't matter, that my voice shouldn't be heard, that my contributions weren't valued. But accepting the Medal of Honor would validate the same system that nearly got those people killed through its refusal to listen to tactical analysis that could have prevented the crisis entirely. She continued with the calm authority that had characterized her leadership during the rescue operation. "The real heroes of this story aren't the officers who planned failed operations or the commanders who recognized tactical expertise only after conventional thinking had been exhausted. The real heroes are the American service members who survived impossible conditions, the French forces who adapted to operational failures they didn't create, and the Chadian civilians who risked their lives to help strangers because it was the right thing to do." Secretary Harrison listened in stunned silence as Sarah articulated a critique of military culture that challenged fundamental assumptions about merit, recognition, and institutional accountability. Colonel Chen, are you suggesting that military leadership should not recognize exceptional performance when it saves American lives? No, ma'am. I'm suggesting that military leadership should recognize exceptional thinking before American lives are put at risk unnecessarily. The same analytical capabilities that solved this crisis were available for months before the operation began, but institutional prejudices prevented that expertise from being utilized until conventional thinking had failed catastrophically. Sarah's final statement carried the weight of someone who had found her voice and intended to use it regardless of personal consequences. Accepting the Medal of Honor would send the message that the system worked, that institutional processes succeeded, that military leadership recognized and utilized available expertise effectively. But that's not what happened. What happened was that systemic failures created unnecessary dangers that unconventional thinking had to overcome through extraordinary measures. The room fell silent as Secretary Harrison processed the implications of Sarah's refusal. An officer was declining America's highest military honor, not from false modesty or political calculation, but from principled opposition to validating institutional failures that had nearly resulted in preventable casualties. Secretary Harrison's response would reshape how the Pentagon approached tactical planning, strategic assessment, and recognition of diverse expertise in military decision-making processes. Sarah's refusal to accept individual recognition for correcting institutional failures would force military leadership to confront systematic problems with how expertise was evaluated. Voices were heard, and strategic thinking was developed within traditional command structures. The decision would transform Sarah from a recipient of military honors into a catalyst for institutional change that addressed fundamental questions about merit, leadership, and accountability in American military culture. Sarah's refusal to accept the Medal of Honor detonated through Pentagon leadership circles like a tactical explosive designed to expose structural weaknesses in America's most prestigious military institution. Within hours of her meeting with Secretary Harrison, senior officers throughout the Department of Defense were grappling with questions they had never anticipated. What did it mean when exceptional performance was rewarded with recognition that the performer rejected as fundamentally flawed? How should military leadership respond when tactical excellence was accompanied by institutional criticism that challenged core assumptions about merit and hierarchy? Secretary Harrison convened an emergency session with the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Thursday afternoon, gathering America's highest-ranking military officers to discuss a situation that had no precedent in modern military history. The conversation took place in the Pentagon's most secure conference room, where decisions affecting global military strategy were typically debated. But the agenda focused on a single officer's principled refusal to accept recognition for saving American lives. General Marcus Whitfield, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, opened the discussion with obvious discomfort about addressing institutional criticism from an officer whose tactical competence was beyond question. Secretary Harrison, Colonel Chen's rescue operation represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking and exceptional leadership that the Medal of Honor was designed to recognize. Her refusal to accept the award creates political and institutional complications that extend far beyond individual recognition ceremonies. The political implications were immediate and significant. Congressional oversight committees had already begun asking questions about operational planning failures that required unconventional rescue operations to prevent American casualties. Media attention was focusing on the systemic problems that Sarah's tactical expertise had overcome, rather than celebrating the successful extraction of trapped personnel. International allies were questioning American military competence in joint operations that required sophisticated cultural and environmental analysis. Admiral Patricia Rodriguez, Chief of Naval Operations, articulated the fundamental challenge that Sarah's position presented to military leadership. The problem isn't that Colonel Chen saved American lives or demonstrated exceptional tactical thinking. The problem is that her analysis suggests institutional failures in strategic planning, cultural intelligence, and resource utilization that prevented her expertise from being utilized before the crisis developed. The Joint Chiefs spent 3 hours analyzing operational procedures, reviewing planning protocols, and examining decision-making processes that had contributed to the Chad operation's near-catastrophic failure. Their assessment revealed systematic problems that extended far beyond individual prejudices or personality conflicts between specific officers. Strategic operations. Command's reliance on conventional intelligence sources had missed crucial environmental and cultural factors that affected operational success. Planning procedures that prioritize speed and confidence over comprehensive analysis had repeatedly produced tactical assessments that ignored important risks. Command structures that valued hierarchy over expertise had systematically excluded diverse perspectives that could have prevented predictable failures. Most troubling was the realization that Sarah's situation wasn't unique within Pentagon culture. Review of recent operations revealed multiple instances where available expertise had been underutilized, alternative perspectives had been dismissed, and innovative thinking had been discouraged in favor of conventional approaches that reinforced existing command relationships. Secretary Harrison commissioned a comprehensive review of military planning procedures, conducted by external analysts who could evaluate institutional culture without the biases that affected internal assessments. The review team included retired military officers, academic specialists in organizational psychology, and international experts who could provide comparative perspective on how other military institutions approached strategic planning and personnel utilization. The preliminary findings were sobering. American military culture had developed systematic barriers to innovative thinking that were particularly pronounced in elite command environments where tradition and hierarchy were most highly valued. Officers who challenged conventional wisdom or offered alternative perspectives faced professional risks that discouraged the kind of tactical innovation that modern military operations increasingly required. General Morrison received a direct order to appear before the Secretary of Defense to explain how strategic operations command's planning procedures had failed so completely that an administrative coordination specialist possessed better tactical intelligence than his senior strategic planning staff. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, providing Morrison with a weekend to develop explanations for institutional failures that had nearly resulted in preventable American casualties. Morrison spent those 3 days conducting his own internal review of Strategic Operations Command's recent planning decisions, analyzing personnel utilization policies, and examining the cultural dynamics that had contributed to Sarah's systematic exclusion from strategic discussions. His assessment revealed uncomfortable truths about his own leadership approach and the institutional assumptions that had shaped his treatment of officers who didn't fit traditional command profiles. The review confirmed that Sarah's tactical expertise had been available throughout the Chad operation planning process, but had been dismissed based on assumptions about her role, her experience level, and her appropriate contributions to strategic discussions. Morrison's staff had possessed access to the same environmental analysis, cultural intelligence, and operational alternatives that Sarah had identified, but had chosen to rely on conventional sources that confirmed their initial planning assumptions, rather than challenging them. More damaging was Morrison's recognition that his exclusion of Sarah from meaningful planning responsibilities had been based on personal prejudices, rather than professional assessments of her capabilities. His assumptions about her qualifications, his skepticism about her strategic thinking abilities, and his resistance to her tactical contributions had been shaped by institutional biases that valued conformity over competence. Lieutenant Colonel Park approached Morrison privately on Friday afternoon with information that further complicated his position. Other officers within Strategic Operations Command had noticed the systematic exclusion of Sarah's expertise and had privately questioned planning decisions that ignored her relevant experience. Park's informal survey revealed that several staff members had recognized tactical problems with the Chad operation, but had remained silent due to command climate that discouraged challenges to senior leadership decisions. General Morrison, Park said carefully, Colonel Chun's tactical analysis was available to anyone who wanted to access her research. She shared her environmental assessments with multiple officers, offered to brief her findings to planning staff, and attempted to raise operational concerns through appropriate channels. The information existed, it just wasn't utilized. The statement highlighted institutional failures that went beyond individual prejudices to encompass systematic problems with how Strategic Operations Command approached decision-making, expertise utilization, and risk assessment. Morrison had created a command climate where tactical innovation was discouraged, alternative perspectives were dismissed, and operational planning was conducted within closed circles that excluded potentially valuable insights. Major Rodriguez provided additional perspective during a scheduled briefing that revealed the broader impact of Sarah's exclusion on unit morale and professional development. Other officers had observed Morrison's treatment of Sarah and had modified their own behavior to avoid similar marginalization, reducing tactical innovation throughout the command structure. Sir, Colonel Chun's situation sent a clear message about what happens to officers who challenge established planning procedures or offer alternative tactical assessments. Rodriguez explained, the result has been reduced willingness to share innovative thinking, decreased tactical flexibility, and planning processes that prioritize consensus over effectiveness. Morrison realized that his leadership approach had created exactly the kind of institutional rigidity that modern military operations couldn't afford. Complex international missions require diverse expertise, cultural intelligence, and tactical flexibility that traditional command structures often discouraged rather than promoted. The weekend review session concluded with Morrison's recognition that reforming Strategic Operations Command would require fundamental changes in personnel utilization, planning procedures, and command climate that went far beyond addressing Sarah's individual situation. The institutional failures that her expertise had exposed represented systematic problems that affected operational effectiveness, personnel development, and strategic planning capabilities. Monday's meeting with Secretary Harrison would require Morrison to acknowledge institutional failures, propose comprehensive reforms, and demonstrate commitment to cultural changes that challenge traditional assumptions about military hierarchy, expertise recognition, and tactical innovation. The conversation would determine not just Morrison's future as a commander, but Strategic Operations Command's evolution toward institutional practices that utilize diverse expertise rather than excluding it. Secretary Harrison's Monday morning meeting with General Morrison lasted 4 hours and resulted in the most comprehensive review of military planning procedures implemented by the Pentagon in over 2 decades. Morrison's acknowledgement of institutional failures within Strategic Operations Command triggered systematic reforms that extended far beyond individual command structures to encompass fundamental changes in how American military institutions approached expertise utilization, tactical innovation, and strategic decision-making processes. The reforms began with immediate changes to personnel utilization policies that required commanders to demonstrate how diverse expertise was being incorporated into planning processes. Strategic Operations Command implemented new protocols that mandated consultation with officers possessing relevant regional experience, cultural knowledge, or specialized analytical capabilities before operational plans could receive approval for implementation. Morrison's command structure was reorganized to ensure that tactical expertise was accessed and utilized rather than marginalized. Based on hierarchical assumptions, Sarah's position within Strategic Operations Command transformed from administrative coordination to Director of Strategic Analysis, a newly created role that placed her specialized expertise at the center of planning processes rather than peripheral to them. Her responsibilities included environmental risk assessment, cultural intelligence integration, and tactical innovation that drew from diverse sources rather than conventional military intelligence alone. The changes extended throughout the Pentagon, as other commands implemented similar reforms, designed to prevent the systematic exclusion of valuable expertise that had characterized Sarah's initial experience. Military planning procedures were revised to require comprehensive analysis that included perspectives from officers with relevant specialized knowledge, regardless of their position within traditional command hierarchies. Most significantly, the Joint Chiefs of Staff established new recognition protocols that acknowledged institutional learning and systematic improvement rather than focusing exclusively on individual heroism that corrected preventable failures. The Medal of Honor nomination process was expanded to include assessment of whether exceptional performance represented individual excellence or compensation for systematic institutional shortcomings that should be addressed through organizational reform. Sarah's refusal to accept recognition for correcting institutional failures had forced military leadership to confront fundamental questions about accountability, expertise utilization, and the relationship between individual achievement and systematic competence. Her principled stand became a catalyst for examining how military culture either encouraged or discouraged the tactical innovation that modern operations increasingly required. 3 months after the Chad operation, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Colonel Hayes, her former commanding officer from Afghanistan, who had traveled to the Pentagon specifically to discuss the institutional changes that Sarah's position had initiated throughout military command structures. Hayes brought news that reforms similar to those implemented at Strategic Operations Command were being adopted by military installations worldwide, creating cultural shifts that affected thousands of officers and operational planning procedures. Chen, you need to understand the scope of what you've accomplished, Hayes said as they walked through Pentagon corridors that now felt fundamentally different to Sarah than they had during her first weeks at Strategic Operations Command. Military academies are revising leadership curricula to include case studies of your Chad operation, focusing not just on the tactical innovation you demonstrated, but on the institutional barriers you overcame to make that innovation possible. Institutional impact extended beyond military education into practical operational improvements that enhanced American military effectiveness in complex international environments. Commands that had previously relied on conventional intelligence sources began incorporating anthropological research, environmental analysis, and cultural expertise that provided comprehensive understanding of operational environments rather than purely tactical assessments. General Morrison's transformation proved as dramatic as the institutional changes his command implemented. His leadership approach evolved from hierarchical control to collaborative expertise utilization, creating command climate that encouraged tactical innovation rather than discouraging challenges to conventional planning assumptions. Morrison publicly acknowledged that his initial treatment of Sarah had reflected institutional prejudices that compromised operational effectiveness and endangered American lives. Colonel Chen forced me to confront assumptions about expertise, authority, and institutional effectiveness that I had never questioned, Morrison told the assembled Strategic Operations Command staff during a ceremony recognizing the 6-month anniversary of the Chad operation's successful conclusion. Her refusal to accept recognition for correcting our failures challenged me to examine whether our command structure encouraged or prevented the tactical thinking that American military operations require. Morrison's acknowledgement of institutional failures and commitment to systematic reform earned him recognition as a leader who could adapt command practices to enhance operational effectiveness. rather than defending traditional approaches that had proven inadequate for modern military. Challenges. His transformation from hierarchical controller to collaborative coordinator became a model for other commanders, facing similar institutional reform requirements. The broader military culture shift accelerated as success stories from reformed command structures demonstrated improved operational outcomes, enhanced personnel development, and increased tactical innovation that benefited American military effectiveness across multiple theaters of operation. Commands that implemented comprehensive expertise utilization reported fewer planning failures, reduced operational risks, and improved coordination with international allies who appreciated American military. Cultural intelligence. Sarah's influence on military education extended beyond case study inclusion to fundamental curriculum reforms that emphasized tactical thinking, cultural analysis, and institutional accountability as core competencies for future military leaders. Officer training programs began incorporating systematic evaluation of how command climate affected expertise utilization, tactical innovation, and operational effectiveness. 6 months after refusing the Medal of Honor, Sarah received a different kind of recognition that aligned with her principles about institutional accountability and systematic improvement. The Pentagon established the Strategic Innovation Award, specifically designed to acknowledge officers whose tactical thinking contributed to institutional learning and systematic military improvement, rather than compensating for preventable failures. Sarah accepted this recognition because it represented acknowledgement of the institutional changes that her principled stand had generated, rather than celebrating individual heroism that had overcome systematic failures. The award ceremony focused on the comprehensive reforms that had enhanced American military effectiveness, rather than highlighting exceptional performance that had corrected preventable problems. Secretary Harrison's presentation speech articulated the institutional learning that Sarah's position had generated. Colonel Chen's greatest contribution to American military effectiveness wasn't the tactical innovation that saved 37 American lives, though that achievement was extraordinary. Her greatest contribution was forcing our institution to examine whether our culture encouraged or prevented the expertise utilization that modern military operations require. The Strategic Innovation Award became an annual recognition for officers whose thinking contributed to institutional improvement, tactical innovation, and systematic enhancement of American military capabilities. The award criteria emphasized analytical contributions that improved planning processes, enhanced cultural intelligence, and promoted expertise utilization that prevented operational failures rather than correcting them after they occurred. Sarah's acceptance speech reflected her commitment to institutional accountability and systematic improvement that had motivated her refusal of individual recognition. Military excellence requires institutions that utilize diverse expertise effectively, encourage tactical innovation consistently, and learn from analytical contributions systematically. Individual heroism cannot substitute for institutional competence, and exceptional performance should enhance systematic capabilities rather than compensating for preventable failures. The transformation that Sarah's principled stand had initiated continued evolving throughout American military culture, creating lasting changes that improved operational effectiveness, enhanced personnel development, and strengthened institutional accountability. Her decision to refuse recognition for correcting systematic failures had generated comprehensive reforms that addressed the root causes of those failures rather than simply celebrating their resolution. 5 years later, strategic operations command had become a model for expertise utilization and tactical innovation that other military institutions studied and implemented. Sarah's influence extended far beyond the Chad operation that had demonstrated her tactical capabilities to encompass institutional changes that enhanced American military effectiveness across all operational environments and command structures. 10. Years after refusing the Medal of Honor, Colonel Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the National Defense University, delivering the keynote address to the graduating class of future military leaders. Her uniform now bore the stars of a brigadier general, but more importantly, she wore the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fundamentally changed how America's military institutions approached expertise, innovation, and accountability. The audience included General Morrison, now retired but present as a guest lecturer who regularly shared his own transformation story with military leadership courses. His presence served as living proof that institutional change was possible when leaders possessed the courage to confront their own prejudices and adapt their approaches to enhance organizational effectiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of proven leadership and institutional respect. 10 years ago, I made a decision that shocked Pentagon leadership. I refused America's highest military honor, because accepting it would have validated the same institutional failures that nearly cost American lives. Today, I want to talk about what we've learned from that experience. She gestured toward a display, showing statistics that demonstrated the transformation of military planning procedures over the past decade. Operational failures due to inadequate cultural analysis had decreased by 78%. Inter-service coordination had improved dramatically through systematic expertise utilization. Most significantly, the military had developed institutional mechanisms that encouraged tactical innovation rather than discouraging challenges to conventional thinking. The Chad operation taught us that individual heroism cannot substitute for institutional competence, Sarah continued. But it also taught us that principled stands can generate systematic changes that benefit thousands of service members and enhance American military effectiveness across all operational environments. The graduating class listened with the intense focus of officers who understood they were receiving guidance from someone whose decisions had reshaped military culture. These future leaders had been educated in institutions that emphasized expertise utilization, cultural intelligence, and tactical innovation as core competencies rather than peripheral considerations. Sarah's final remarks addressed the fundamental questions that her refusal had raised about recognition, accountability, and institutional learning. Military excellence requires leaders who understand that the greatest achievements aren't always individual accomplishments, but institutional improvements that prevent others from facing unnecessary dangers. Sometimes the most courageous decision isn't accepting recognition for your own performance, but demanding accountability for systematic failures that put others at risk. The standing ovation that followed reflected recognition from military leaders who understood that Sarah's principled stand had enhanced their own capabilities, improved their institutional effectiveness, and strengthened American military culture in ways that benefited every service member. As Sarah left the podium, she was approached by a young lieutenant whose research project had analyzed the long-term impact of the strategic planning reforms initiated by Sarah's refusal to accept the Medal of Honor. "General Chen," the lieutenant said, "your decision prevented operational failures that would have cost hundreds of American lives over the past decade. The institutional changes you initiated have saved more lives than any individual combat action could have." Sarah smiled, understanding that this young officer represented the future of military leadership that valued institutional accountability as highly as individual courage. "Lieutenant, that's exactly why principles matter more than recognition. The greatest victories aren't always the ones that get commemorated with ceremonies and medals. Sometimes they're the ones that prevent future battles from becoming unnecessary tragedies." Today, the Strategic Innovation Award that Sarah established continues recognizing officers whose analytical thinking enhances institutional effectiveness rather than simply correcting preventable failures. Her legacy lives on in military planning procedures that utilize diverse expertise, command climates that encourage tactical innovation, and institutional cultures that value systematic improvement over individual recognition. The woman who walked into the Pentagon and was dismissed as a diversity hire had become the general who transformed how America's military institutions approach expertise, accountability, and strategic thinking. Her refusal to accept recognition for correcting institutional failures had generated comprehensive reforms that enhanced American military effectiveness far beyond what any individual medal could represent. If this story of courage, principles, and institutional transformation inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who believe that real change comes from standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything. We share stories like Sarah's every week, tales of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices that changed the world around them. What story would you like us to tell next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that nobody gets a medal for.